okay, let me know, because sometimes I go low in my voice and I don't see that. My name is Ahmet, and I am the Director of Office of Language Assessment at the University of Chicago, which is under Chicago Language Center as a unit. So today we'll have a 3-hour workshop, basically the first kind of 75 minutes, and there's kind of a small break. And then we'll have a second part, which is going to be more hands-on. So I will make you work a little bit in the second half. So in the first half, please do stop me if you have any questions. It's not like a formal presentation. It's a workshop, so anything that's not clear or you need clarification for, please stop me and ask that at that moment instead of waiting until the end. That could be better. So today I'll be looking at the reverse design, but from the perspective of assessment, language assessment. So how we actually foregrounding assessment, to engineer. We're using this word very purposefully, and you will see why during the second half. Actually, we'll ask you to engineer something. So we engineer the proficiency-oriented curricula. Okay, so basically as a way to teach, a literal language, as a methodology, as a philosophy, to teach a literal language. So as I said, I'm gonna be briefly talking about what it is, what I'm gonna talk about, and the motivation behind it, and then I will explain reverse design, and then I will talk about how actually it can be operationalized, in a way that makes sense, for digital languages, and also giving you as an instructor the ownership, not just someone else, of this process. And then in the second part, we will actually showcase with, of course, just one piece of it, how you can actually do this in your own institution when you leave this workshop, and if you like this idea, how you can actually do that. And then we'll have some conclusion remarks and discussion if you need. So what is reverse design? Reverse design actually originally as a term comes from general education field. It's a very famous book, actually it's not going to be that famous, that's why people maybe not know about it. In the general education, it's called reverse design, basically McTighe book. I can give you the full, I forgot to actually put the citation here, but I can give you the full citation at the end. So if you're interested in the book itself, so that will be one thing you can follow up, to get. There's also a workbook that comes with the book that kind of, takes you through the process, but it's nothing to do with language teaching. So it is a general education book, so you will have to, basically tailor it or adapt it to your own needs. So we are talking about real work right here to begin with when we're talking about reverse design in language teaching. Okay, so why that is the case? Because we are preparing our students for real world success, right? In other words, so we want them to be successful using whatever language we teach in the real world for whatever purposes they are learning it. Okay, so that's very important. First of all, to identify, therefore, when we teach a class, to learn what is the reason that our students are learning this language and where and how they're going to be using it. Okay, so this is very critical to begin with. So, but everything is real work. In other words, we are not, I assume, not preparing our students to pass a test, which is like an intermediate kind of purpose for language learning. Maybe not for your language, but for English, English as a second language, for example. That's a big purpose for many students, to pass a test. But test is not a real word, language use. It's just to get in somewhere. Okay, but for your language, it could be like using this language purposefully for something, in the future. And then we assume that, this is something we will agree on by default today, that at fall, whether you agree or don't agree, okay, that's a different kind of discussion, but for today, if we don't agree on this one, then we cannot move on. So basically what we do today is gonna be saying ACTFL has defined, what it means to use language in the real world. So we're gonna agree on that kind of concept. So therefore, when we say real world, we have no chance, any one of us, to go actually analyze, right, the domain, that target place, whatever that language is, ourselves, right, and try to analyze what it is like to talk or to, speak, listen, write, read in your language. But we know that ACTFL has done this for us, overall. They did this analysis and they defined certain guidelines, that are representative of real world language use. So we agree and we're gonna use ACTFL terminology today. It could be CFR, there are other, of course, guidelines in the world. The one is Common European Framework of Reference, like CFR is another one, which is mostly used in Europe, but sometimes also in the US. So, but today we're gonna be working on ACTFL. And then the other piece of reverse design and the way we are operationalizing it, actually is deciding on an assessment that can measure whatever we agreed on to be our target functions, okay, based on ACTFL. And then when we talk about an assessment, we are looking for an authentic way of assessing these skills rather than, doing it, for example, through multiple choice. So one thing we did at the University of Chicago, and the way we operationalized this reverse design, we said that multiple choice is no way we can go with, right? So because we claim that multiple choice as a format does not allow us to measure what we define here, as it should be. So we said no to multiple choice anyway, and this is because we are not also talking about building a standardized test, right, that can be used by millions. We are talking about a classroom level assessment, and therefore multiple choice is not the only option for us. We are dealing most of the case with very limited number of students here in your classes. Therefore we don't need to be thinking in the way that standardized tests are thinking. Okay. And then at the end, once we have an assessment in place, and this assessment is basically a summative assessment that can measure our end of something goal. It could be end of semester, end of quarter, if you're in a quarter system, end of course, or end of the year. But this we are talking about building a summative assessment, first here, and then realign the curriculum that we teach to that assessment. Why are we realigning the curriculum to the assessment? Because you are going to be the one who design and develop that assessment, and you will know what it means and what it takes to pass that exam. So now the question is, are we then preparing our students in the class to pass the exam? So that is like the first question that comes into mind. So how come this is real work? We just started, with saying we need to rely on the real world, and now we are talking about an assessment. So basically, the moment we create an assessment, right, that we think can measure these real world outcomes, then it's okay and it's fine, completely fine to be looking at the assessment, when we realign our curriculum. Because there's gonna be like alignment between the assessment and the real world, and therefore passing that exam means real stuff they can do with the language. It's not like having a test that tells them what they know about, let's say, particles, in the language. We are talking about an assessment that is comprehensive, that's proficiency oriented. I will come and explain that very soon. And that is representative of real world language use abilities. Okay? So motivation, right? Why do we even adapt this reverse design as a method or as a system basically to operationalize this communicative basically approach? Communicative language teaching, right, all of you know, is a very long established concept, right? And also on top of that, we have these proficiency guidelines, like ACTFL is one of them, CFR is another, and we have others as well. So, but we had a lack of systematic, basically, framework for the operationalization of these guidelines. So everybody, used these guidelines in a certain way, but there is no framework, as far as we know, basically that tells us how to do this, considering the diversity of language instructors and institutions. We cannot talk about like a very prescriptive thing here. We are talking therefore about a framework that can be adapted to different institutions. And that's why we chose reverse design as a framework of operationalizing, is a difficult word, I'm going to be using a lot, these guidelines here. Okay? So, for example, MSU, BYU, we do have a lot of efforts. Like these are just two examples, and even your institutions, they're using these guidelines. They're pushing for communicative language teaching, but in general, in the field, we don't have like a systematic work, a framework. Therefore, we thought like reverse design as a framework, is probably a good, framework to begin with this. So how do we view then proficiency-oriented communicative curricula? So which is based on communicative approach, right? So we have two components of that. So as I said at the beginning, we're gonna rely on proficiency guidelines, okay? Because we don't have time and energy and money, whatever, to go and do that analysis ourselves. So we're gonna rely on 50-year or like around 50, 1980s, right, where ACTFL started, I guess. So that kind of work they have done so far, and also CFR. And then we will foreground assessment, which is a representative of those guidelines. And then we will therefore push for, based on those two pieces, or build proficiency-oriented communicative curricula on these two components. So, therefore, the first step, right, after we agree that, guidelines, proficiency guidelines, are representative of real work, because that's where we don't do anything, then we need to create a summative measure, right, a summative assessment. As I said, it can be end of something for you. If you are teaching the whole year, ideally this should be the end of that year. If you are teaching only one semester, so this is ideally the end of that semester. So depending on how your course is structured, basically. So, and these are not just, any kind of summative. Summative assessments are at the center of this process. So we agree on that. So to begin with, we start with this. But we are talking about a summative measure, basically, of knowledge, shifting from a summative measure of knowledge about the language. So we are not, in other words, creating a summative test in an achievement format, okay? We are not testing the knowledge about the language, but we are creating a summative assessment that measures the ability to use language. Okay, so that is also something we agree on. So once we create this summative assessment at the end of the year, so this summative assessment, remember, should be representative of the target outcomes we are looking for. Therefore, if you look at those outcomes, they are proficiency outcomes, they're proficiency guidelines. Therefore, we need to create an assessment that is proficiency oriented. What that means, it needs to measure language used, not the knowledge of the language. Okay? So you will have a lot of tests during the year, like we would call them formative tests or unit tests, that will measure the knowledge of the language, because that is for that particular unit, you need something diagnostic to, rely on. But when we come to the end of the year, we shouldn't be thinking of an achievement test as our final exam. If you consider the summative as a final exam, so we should be talking about a proficiency-oriented summative test or final test, so that once they pass this test, we are confident as an instructor claiming that they can do this, that in the real world. Yeah.
Question. Can you clarify what you mean measures of knowledge about language? Because I've been learning foreign languages, English, French, Arabic, German, in the more conservative, traditional methods. I can't think of a real or a question or anything I did in the traditional exams that measures my knowledge about the target language. I had to use it, which is also communication.
Right.
Maybe I had to answer multiple choice question, which was all right, or do this kind of fill-in drills. It wasn't measures of knowledge about the language. They asked me to use the language.
Right. So that's a kind of the approach that you can take, and a lot of people use fill in the blanks, multiple choice as a way to measure use of language. But we, again, as I started, we claim that, and personally myself, and also the program that we build, that's not a good alignment with the real life. Because in real life, no one stops you in the middle of the street and asks you to fill in the blanks. That's like a pedagogical perspective to teach language or to test language, but it doesn't exist in real life. Real life, if you, let's say, think of a student, learning language in your class, and his or her goal is to go to that target country that you're teaching the language for, and then do study abroad, right? Think of that context. So we are preparing our students. When I say real life, we are thinking of this kind of real life purposes. So in that kind of environment, this student will be interacting, let's say, if with a professor or with an instructor, with friends, with maybe a host family, right? With retail people, right? Can you think of any cases in that environment of using language in multiple choice format or in fill in the blanks format? No, because that's why we say when we test for that environment, because we're going to claim that they can do X, Y, Z in that environment, therefore our test must be representative of that environment so that our claim is accurate. If you test something with, let's say, multiple choice, and this includes a lot of standardized tests, the claim they are making is very big. They're actually using multiple choice or fill in the blanks, but the claim they make on the basis of that is real life. So they have to justify, as an institution, whoever does that test, justify how that claim is accurate. Yeah.
I understand. I mean, that's the idea of proficiency-oriented
Right.
tests, but sometimes it takes so long to
Yeah.
evaluate.
Yeah, that is very obvious, and that's why we are not talking about, when we say, takes a lot of time, you're talking about 20 students, right? Maybe, I don't know, how many students do you usually have? Like
60.
60.
Yeah.
That's that's it, right? Any more than like 70, 100, 200?
5.
Again? 5? Yeah. So it could be, let's say, in your language that's up to 60, but still it's manageable. And we are going to talk about, again, creating a system here, that you'll be designing it. It's not going to be like a top-down, that somebody gives you something and says, okay, use it. So once you design it, you will know everything about it. And therefore, you'll be, in charge of using it. And I'm sure there will be other instructors in your program, so you'll not be the only one, grading this. Grading is going to be the most challenging part in this kind of assessment. It's not actually preparation. It's going to be easier to prepare such a test than preparing a multiple choice, believe me. Preparing multiple choice is the hardest thing to do, or even in the blanks, because you have to be thinking of distractors, all these details, one of them should not lead to another. If you really think about a good quality test, multiple choice test is a lot harder to develop, but it's very easy to grade. So this one is vice versa. It is actually easier to develop, but it's gonna be harder to grade. But once you have multiple people, if you're dealing with 60 people, and divide this, across basically grading, the sections, is gonna be, we have done it. That's why it is actually doable. It's not impossible. But again, that's the way to think about. But if you think of, again, philosophy, if you believe in this philosophy, so that's where we start. And that's why when I started, I said we are agreeing on proficiency-oriented curriculum and guidelines here. If you're not agreeing on that, then you can do any way you want, to test, basically. So to go back to your Ahmet's question, what do I mean by knowledge of the language? So what that I mean, very simply, instead of testing for articles, particles, pronunciation, grammar, vocabulary in an isolated fashion, testing the use of it, not the knowledge of it. Like creating a fill in the blanks, and for example, I'm not going to give the language, but I got a test that was measuring the end of first year proficiency at the University of Chicago when I first started. And I look at the test, the 70%, I'm not exaggerating, of the test was all about particles. So then I was saying, what's going on here? Like, why is it so big here? So I did ask some experts, so what's going on like in that language? So why are you testing so much about these particles? And they say it is everything, in that language. So if you don't know that, you don't know language, basically. That's why I say, okay, let's now leave that idea somewhere. Is it like the way you are doing it? Is it how they're gonna use it in real life? They said, no, people don't use it anymore. I said, okay, then what's the point? Right? They said they don't use it anymore. It's just almost disappearing. I'm not gonna give the language, but you might guess the language. So, so then there is a mismatch, right? You're teaching something even and testing for something that they're not gonna be using, or it's not gonna be useful the moment they leave the classroom. So if our goal is to create a group of students with high passes or A's passing our classes, we are fine. But if we are talking about creating a group of students who will be successful in the real world context of that language, then we are talking about this kind of system. Am I clear? Well, okay. So then I'm not, of course, gonna teach you how to design such a test, in this workshop. That's we usually do in a 3-day workshop, very intensive 3-day workshop, to basically learn about designing such tasks. But I will just take you over the process very quickly of showing you how to think about it. Okay? So to know that, we need to first of all think about what we want the tests to tell us, right, in an ideal world. So that because we're gonna rely on the results of that test, right, we need to know from the beginning what we want that test to tell us. So in an ideal world, like students perform tasks on a test, right? And then that tasks will presumably, provide information about the construct of interest. In other words, don't worry about the word construct here. It's so it's basically what we're trying to measure. It's gonna tell something about what we're trying to measure. Okay? So construct is like a meaningful interpretation of an observed behavior. You put a student in a test, you observe that performance, and whatever you interpret from that is what you're trying to tell about it. It's basically, in more concrete ways, a construct refers to the knowledge, the skill, or the ability that's being tested, right? Is that clear? So I'm not going to go into what it means in detail, but simply it is the skill, the knowledge, and the ability that we are trying to test. Okay? So think of a student score on a reading test, right? Students sit down for a test, taking a reading exam, and he or she gets a score, right? And then this score that we have, it could be A, it could be 80, 90, whatever that is you're using, okay, is an indicator of what? Reading comprehension knowledge, right? That's what we claim. That's what we are testing, right? If we're giving a reading test, we get a score, and we claim that that score is an indicator of their reading comprehension knowledge, okay? So in this case, what is my construct here? Reading comprehension knowledge. Because that was what I wanted to test. That's why I created this test. And that's how I graded, and I got a score, and now I claim something about students' reading comprehension. I said they know this much about this, whatever. Okay, that's interpretation. So, in other words, the construct that gives meaning is basically the meaning behind the score, right? Scores are arbitrary, right? They're numbers. They don't mean anything. If you don't attach a meaning to them, right, they don't mean anything. So that meaning that we're talking about is what we call construct. You know, you're familiar with TOEFL, right? TOEFL exam, so for ESL to come North America and study, you know, they have numbers, you know, from 1 to 120, and like 30 for each skill. But they have like a 2-page explanation, you know, for that score. That explanation that they put in that is the construct they're trying to explain. Okay? And that's why universities in North America rely on that, saying that if they have this, then they're good to go and study here. They make interpretations based on that score, you know, about students' skills. So, in other words, if you think of language tests, so language tests attempt to measure different constructs which underline language ability. Okay? So you can test for as specific as articles, you know, or like listening, right? Reading, you can think of that way, or you can think of language ability as a whole. Okay? But each test, basically when we create, is measuring something, you know, about the language, or measuring the language as a whole. So, in other words, language tests, you know, basically act as an operational definition of the construct. We don't see construct. Construct is not something any one of us talks about, right, when we design a test, because that is something behind the scenes. But when we design the test is basically the operational definition of the construct. So this is where we kind of stop and think about, okay, what kind of, you know, definition of language I have. You know, that will impact the way you design the test. You know, if you go all the way back to grammar translation method, right, where no other method, you know, existed, right? How was the operationalization of that thinking? Grammar translation method. So the way they operationalize that, they would give you one sentence, right, or one passage, right, and you would need to just study translating it, right, you know, with a group or by yourself, right, and then learn the language that way by translating from the target language to your language, or vice versa. Because the idea was what? Language ability is something you can learn in that way. So if you come all the way to today, to communicative language approach, then the definition of language has changed, right? What it means to learn a language or what it means to speak a language has changed. So therefore, when we design a test, and if we're claiming that we are designing a test in the communicative manners, then that test must represent that thinking accurately. Okay? That's why we are talking about proficiency-oriented tests here, not just achievement tests in this case. Okay, so again, the students perform tasks on a test, and that will tell us something about students' ability. Students get a score for how well they perform these tasks, and then based on the scores, we make inferences about students' ability to use target language. So, and we make inferences in ideal world about how that language ability is contextualized in the target language use domain, not in our classroom. Because our classroom is not the target context for students. Yes, there will be students in our class where the classroom is the target. They just need a class for 5 credits or 4 credits, and they need A, and they will be done with it. For this kind of students, yes, the classroom is the target context. And honestly, we don't have to worry about these students, right? So if you think of them, they don't have a real life purpose of using the language. For them, the target context is the classroom.
Which
But
we have to respect.
yeah, we have to respect, but you know, it is, when you think of the language as a skill, it's not something stays in the classroom, right? The purpose of language is basically to use and speak, right? That's why we are learning languages. I think that's something we all agree on. Yeah, we do have to respect, it's their legal rights, you know, to come into the classroom to get a grade. We have to respect that, but that shouldn't be what we are targeting as a curricula, okay? So we should be contextualizing our target context in the real world, okay? So this will be like an internship for, I'm just making up, study abroad, or living there, going on for a vocation in that target context, anything that you can think of in real life. So based on these beliefs about their ability, you know, we make decisions. You know, let's say, how many of you do Fulbright tests in your languages? Like Fulbright sometimes asks you to do tests, right? Because they're gonna decide whether or not these students can speak this language in the target country. So when you give that test, right, you have a huge responsibility, right, to Fulbright, because you're claiming that, you know, this student can function in that target country. Is that right? Because they're gonna be there, living by themselves, doing something, teaching, researching, basically studying abroad. So the test you give for Fulbright will be claiming that they can do this. And therefore, Fulbright makes decisions based on what? Based on your final report to them. Okay? Because they will you know, rely on you in that decision. And therefore, the test that you will give, they don't have a format for it. They could be any test, they say. You know, the test that you give to that student, because the claim is so big, must be what? Can it be like an achievement test, you think? Or does it need to be like a proficiency test? It used to be a proficiency, because the claim that you are making on top of that is very big, okay? So there should be like an alignment between that. So therefore, we are going back to the first point where we started. Remember, what was the number 1 item? Real world, right, in the process. What was the second? Actual guidelines. So, actual guidelines in this kind of context is our construct. They already defined language skills language ability in proficiency terms. So that's what we agree on to start with. So when we are talking about construct at this point or from right now, anytime I say construct, it means actual guidelines. Okay, it's not that in the field, but the way we operationalizing that is this way. So we're gonna treat actual guidelines as the construct that we are trying to measure. Okay, because they have defined language ability for us, and they break it down, right, into certain levels, proficiency levels. So they have defined what it means to be, they have names. Those names are not like golden standard, but they have to have names. Like what it means to be intermediate low, intermediate mid, intermediate high, advanced low, advanced mid. So we have a definition for each of this. And then we have functions they have put together to define what that skill means. Okay? So therefore, we start with defining that, and why is it so important to start from there instead of starting just creating the test, right? When you say write a test, right? If you just give like such an open-ended kind of instruction to someone, it is endless, right? You need to know what it is you're trying to measure. You need to know that construct first before you even start thinking about, the tasks and designing it. Therefore, we need to define that, and we already, it has already been defined for us, so that we don't have to worry. If we agree on that, we don't have to worry the definition of the language. Okay? So that's why I said we agree on actual guidelines. If we don't agree on that, then everything I say will not make sense today. Because that means you are not agreeing on how we define the construct. Okay, so therefore we are going to be thinking of completely different testing than what we are talking today. Okay, so it is important to have this definition in mind because we make inferences on the basis of learners' performance in a test, and the test acts as what? An operationalization of that construct. So we don't see the construct anymore, we see the test. If the test is very well aligned, with that, then we are fine. Okay? Because that is gonna be the thing students will see, that's gonna be the thing we will grade, that's gonna be the thing we will make decision on the scores. So if that construct, if the test is either misrepresenting that definition or underrepresenting it, then what is the problem? The test will not tell us what we want the test to tell us. Right? Remember, once we write the test, we have something in mind. We want to know something about a student. And if we have defined that, but we couldn't test it, or we tested it but not enough, then whatever we get out of that test is gonna be misrepresenting that skills. Therefore, it is so important, to design a test that is representative of that definition. Okay? So think of language tests like that. So in traditional manner, like in any language testing, like classroom level classroom testing, language test and assessment comes first, and then we usually don't define it as a construct, but we give meaning to the score as a grader, as an instructor, and then we claim that that score is the representative of that target language's domain. Like, in other words, to make it more concrete, you have a final exam, not you, but just anyone, right, has a final exam, and then let's say you have A to C grades, right, in the final exam, or A+, So A plus versus A versus B plus versus B, right, will each mean something different, right? There's going to be a meaning attached to each of this. And based on that meaning, we claim that this student, with A plus is a star, right? And can do anything, in the target function or in the target domain. So the question I'm trying to pose here is, how confident are we when we say this student, A plus student, can do this, this, and that? That's the point. If you're confident in your claim once a student gets A in your class as a grade at the end of the course, and that student can do X, Y, Z in the real world, then we are good to go. That's what we are trying to establish here. Okay? So it is that claim that you need to be justifying, and once you have a test, once you have a good test in place, actually it is that moment where you learn how much students could do in your class. But if you are testing only what you teach, this is very tricky, right? If you are testing only what you teach, and all of your students are successful in this test, how confident can you be that student will do well in the real world context? That's the question. I'm not challenging you. I am basically trying to show the way to think because those scores that you're assigning at the end of the course are so important. That could be maybe the only thing an employer will rely on when they hire someone. So, do you know Portuguese? Yeah, I know Portuguese. Let's say they put all kinds of descriptions in LinkedIn profiles, right? A lot of different ways of putting in their CVs. And what's your proof? I got Portuguese class, in my undergrad. How many? This many. 2 years of Portuguese. What's your? And they're gonna look at A, B, C, right? That's the proof. And the employer will rely on what? Will rely on that knowledge, that evidence. So the question now is, how confident are we when we put these A's, B's there? That A is a representative of the real world success of language use and ability. Yes?
So what do you recommend, because, for example, in our grading system, a good chunk of the grade comes from pre and post activities as a way to prepare for the...
Right.
So how do you recommend we fit all the pieces of the grade into this?
Yeah, so I will come back to that. So that's why we're trying to create this as a system instead of just like an arbitrary thing. If you start with this proficiency guidelines, and if you have summative assessment, a good summative assessment that can measure those outcomes comfortably, then the curriculum part comes at the end, which includes everything else. When you say realigning the curriculum, this is exactly what we are talking about. Once you have your ultimate goal, how can you take students there, right? What kind of activities you should do in class? What kind of materials you can use, right? What kind of tests? Because it's not going to be the only one at the end of the year. They're going to be doing a lot of tests throughout the year, right? We call these formative tests. Or some of these will be formal ones. They will have actually testing time. And some of them will be informal. They will be testing their performance as they do a presentation, for example. Or as they do a group work, for example. There will be formal ways of assessing themselves and informal. So now the grading system, therefore, should be in a way that once you put all this together, create a meaningful chunk at the end. I cannot ever tell you, okay, you should be doing this percentage of X and this percentage of Y. If I start telling you that, I will be lying here. It's not a prescriptive. It is a bottom-up thing that you, as an instructor, need to think about this. But how do you think about this once you have something at the end of the year, that's why we say summative assessment is so critical there. Once you know what it means to pass this exam, what it takes to pass this exam, because you developed that exam yourself, then you will think back and realign everything you do very naturally. That's why this system works. It's not like a top-down something imposing something on you. Because you set the goal, and now you are the boss to engineer that path. Okay? So this is similar to like Kathy, my boss, director of Chicago Language Center, always gives this example. Like if you have a GPS, the best GPS in the world, right? What is the thing you need to enter for GPS to work? The destination, right? So once the only condition that GPS is working, right, is what? Is the destination. You put the destination, and then GPS starts to work. In this case, it's like maybe a weird analogy. You are the GPS as an instructor. Okay? So you're gonna be probably the best GPS in the world in your language, but if you don't know where you're taking your students at the end, you might not work very well. But once you know that, you will be considering a lot of things. You will be considering the number of red lights. You'll be considering the fastest way, the cheapest way. Yeah? So GPS are working differently, right? So we have, it is recorded, but we have like something called Waze, right? Have you ever heard that? So that kind of GPS is completely different than what? Than Google Maps, for example. Why? Because they're thinking this process differently. Waze is going to tell you the cameras, the police, and everything. But Google will not tell you that. Because their end goal is different. And the way they conceptualize the process is different. This is exactly the same thing we're talking about. So think of yourself as a GPS, as an instructor, and you have an end goal as an end destination. How can you take your students to there, thinking of all these kind of factors in your way? Fastest, the most convenient, most practical way of taking your students to that. Of course, you'll need to think about your resources there, right? Whether or not you have a TA or language assistant, LA, is going to be a big factor. The number of hours you have, the books you have, the materials you have access to. All of this are going to be in your basically toolbox, right? And you know what you're going to make at the end. So you need to use that toolbox to make that ultimate thing you are interested in. Okay? So the point that I'm trying to make here, let's agree on, if we agree on, that ACTFL has done a good job of defining, there are a lot of criticism about that. I agree with a lot of them as well. But if we agree on that, then we already know our destination, and we have defined that, whether that is intermediate low, novice high, novice mid, whatever that is, we agreed on it and we defined that, and we actually created like a roadmap, which is your target functions. After the description, you have these target functions, the can-do statements, right? This is kind of your roadmap. And then now, once you have that, you created the test that can measure those, and now it is time to think about your curriculum. Can your current curriculum take your students to there comfortably? And you need to answer this question. This is the process that you will be training yourself in, but only when you have a good test at the end. Because that is the moment where you will learn how well you could do this. But if you have a test that tells you nothing, then it's not useful, right? Therefore, we are talking about this meaningful test as basically the beginning of everything. That's why we are foregrounding assessment, like to the center and make it to the center of this process. So to go back to our philosophy, so instead of going like in a linear way, so we need to put the target language use domain as our target, the real life, okay? And then we define what it means to speak language in that context. And good news is these two parts have been done for us. So we are not doing this. This will take forever. I mean, to basically define this by ourselves. I mean, you can do this in maybe specific contexts, but for the whole language, it's going to take you a lot of time to do this. So what we need to do is to create this language test or assessment that is representative of what? Representative of this. And then because this is representative of that. Okay? So we already rely on actful guidelines because we believe that currently it is one of the best options. It's not the best, but it's one of the best options that represents this real life language use. Okay? So our goal is to use a test that operationalize what actful gives us as a guideline. Okay? Or gives us as a construct. Okay? You are familiar with OPI, right? Actful OPI. How many of you actually have been actful trained? Either like 4-day workshop or mini OPI? Okay, so most of you. That's great. So then you know what I'm talking about when I talk about guidelines. So you are familiar then with OPI, right? So if you think of the format of OPI, how it is operationalized, the actual OPI, you have 101, right? First of all, think of the OPI. Is it a group or 101? It's 101, right? And then you have a tester, right? That's you, and you have a test taker, student, right? So how is the test built there? Do you give something to students to fill out? Like how does that work? You naturally, like that's the goal, right? You naturally trying to build up a conversation in a simulated environment. It's not a real environment, right? Ideally, you want to test the people in that real environment, but that's impossible. We already give up on that idea because that's not practical. So you put students in a simulated environment, right? And then you talk to that student and you build that conversation naturally as much as possible. How do you start? You start with what? Real questions first? No, right? You start with warming up. You just welcome students, so that students, feel comfortable. You just trying to create a very comfortable environment. But at the same time, what are you doing there in that warm-up situation? You're also collecting what? You're collecting information about the student, so that the conversation you're building is not artificial. That's the point, right? So you're not building an artificial conversation, you're building something about the student. Whatever you collect in that warm-up is your actually topic pool, right? So then you know what you can talk about and what you cannot talk about. Okay, and then you start asking questions, right? And creating this follow-up questions as much as possible. So what is number one rule Actful is teaching you as to do that OPI? What's the key goal in the OPI? Is to elicit what? To elicit the language, right? So that we can make decisions about students' performance. What is the key there? How can you elicit the language? What's the key point in doing that? Is asking the right questions. You're gonna be asking about the students, you're gonna be asking about something they told you about, but you need to be formulating your questions in a way that elicits that language that you're interested in. Because if you don't have an evidence of performance, you cannot make decisions on it. So now think of this format. I'm not going to explain everything, so then you go ask the floor questions. You know, you want to make sure the student is in that before you go more difficult questions. You need to make sure you are asking about 3 different topics as much as possible. You know, if you have enough evidence, you can go, but ideally you want to make sure you have enough evidence before you move up and ask a probe question. So, and then somewhere you also introduce a role play, right? So in role play, again, it's a simulated, real life, you know, task, you know, where you trying to test students' performance in that environment, but he's not there yet, so you have to simulate it. So in that role play, so what is the point there? Are you just interested in eliciting the language on, like, you asking questions and them answering? There's one more thing there, right? You trying to also make them what? Make them ask you the questions. You know, think of that kind of, now stop, let's say, for a moment and think of that role play task. It's a task, right? Forget about the whole thing. So think of this role play task, and I said we have 2 goals there. We trying to have students' performance in that environment, and then part of that we are trying to make students ask questions. Why is that? Because asking questions, or asking the right question, has been defined as what? As one of the characteristics of which level in Expo? Intermediate level. So now you think of, that's a construct, right? That they have defined that for us. They said, if you're at the intermediate level, you know, the expectation is that you should also be able to ask the right question, formulate the questions. Think of that construct definition. There's a definition for us. Now, how we are testing it? We could test it like creating a 1-page document, right? And putting the questions in the target language, but, you know, not in the right order, and would ask students to reorder the pieces of questions in and make a question. Right? This is a very traditional, you know, sometimes way of testing whether or not students can ask the questions, right? Is that a proficiency test if you do that way? You simply put 20 lines of questions, right? And then you ask them reorder, and they write it down. You have all the options for them, but you ask them to reorder it.
You write the questions?
You write the questions, you just ask them to reorder it. Very traditional way of, you know, testing, right? It's kind of fill in the blanks type of world, right? So is that a proficiency test?
Could it be a reading proficiency then?
Yeah, I'm talking about, you see, I'm talking about this one particular construct, the ability to ask questions. So remember, that's our construct. We're trying to now operationalize it. We're trying to test that in a way that is meaningful, okay? So the one option I gave you is what? To write the questions yourself and then ask them to reorder it, right? And then you mark those depending on how well they reordered the questions. And then you claim what? Once they have passed this test, you claim that they can ask questions.
But
Okay,
we are
so
talking about OPIs here.
no, not OPI. I'm talking about, I'm going to come to the OPI. So OPI is how ACTFL operationalized that definition.
What do you mean by reordering?
Like, you write the question, but you put why, and let's talk about English, right? You put when at the end, are somewhere, and then, you know, you put you here, living here, and you're expecting to say where are you living, okay? So, or where do you live? You know, you just literally put the whole thing there, but they're not in the right order. You ask them to reorder it, okay? To form a question, okay?
The word order.
Again?
The word order.
The word order, yeah, the sentence order in this case, yeah?
Phrase the question.
Yeah, to phrase the question, to formulate the questions. But let's come to the OPI, back to OPI. How does OPI formulate this, operationalize this? They ask you to do a role play task. and they ask you to situationally put the student in that role play task. Say, you are this, in this, doing this, I am this person doing that. So you explain this role play to students as a scenario, and then you say, let's act out. Okay? So, and then you naturally create this scenario and then build a conversation or a role play around that scenario. And then you are expecting students to ask questions. So you create the scenario in a way that students is forced to ask the question, but you don't tell students what kind of questions to ask or even how to ask. Okay, for example, you say you have been accepted to a study abroad program in X country. It's very important to put that. You're gonna be staying with Miss X as a host family. Okay? You gonna have a Skype call before you go, asking about what to bring and what to do, like house rules and everything. So I am the host family and you are yourself, like a student, and ask me questions about your, status. This is like a scenario we are creating. So first of all, we make students think that he's not in the United States anymore because he can use English here. So he is in the target context, and he is talking to who? The host family. And what's the point there? He or she is going to be talking in the target language, right? And therefore, we also create like a need for student. You're going to be staying with this family, and you want to know this, and that. So now students has to ask questions, right? In this kind of, because that's why he's going to have the conversation. So, and think of this task now. Students are in the role play, they are acting it, and then we evaluate their performance, whether or not they can ask questions and can successfully complete this, role play. And then we make a claim at the end saying the students either can or cannot ask questions. So think of the first one, reordering one, and think of this as a format. Which one, gives you more confidence about the claim? About the claim you're making. You're making the same claim. You're saying this student can ask questions in the target context in this language. So which format gives you more evidence? The second one. Okay, that's why we're talking about, when we're talking about aligning, we're talking about this thinking. We could measure this definition in many different ways. I just gave you 2 examples. But there are tons of other ways you can actually measure the same thing. But each time you're measuring, you need to be thinking of the claim you are making at the end. How justified that is, and how confident you are making that claim. That's why bringing the task to the closer to the real life as much as possible, is the key here. So the more authentic your task is, the more justified your claim can be. That's what we're trying to do. Yes, it's unpractical doing this format, because that means you need to spend at least 10 minutes or 15 minutes with your student in a one-on-one, versus giving 1 page to everyone at the same time and give them 20 minutes, you're done in 20 minutes, regardless of the number of your students. And grading the role play versus grading that 1 sheet of reordering is different again. You're gonna be thinking differently and spending more time. But this is what we are talking about. It's about your philosophy. If you believe in this philosophy, then we should be seeking this kind of method and format versus that kind of. Because if we are claiming that we are doing communicative approach, but we are doing this kind of practices, we are kind of mismatching ourselves with our belief there. That's why if your teaching philosophy is communicative language teaching, you need to be thinking everything and make sure that they're aligned with each other. Okay? So I'm gonna give you, okay, so this is what I was talking about. Like if you think of articles, phonetic alphabet, grammar, pronunciation, directly the representative of this, then we're talking about a mismatch here. Yes, do we need them? Yes, we need them. Do we measure accuracy in actual OPI? Question for you, yes.
Yes.
We do measure grammar? Yes. Do we measure vocabulary? Yes. We still are measuring it. You know, when we are talking about this, people think, oh, you don't pay attention to grammar, you don't pay attention to pronunciation. No, everything is still there. Is that we are not doing that in an isolated fashion. We are doing it as it appears in real life. But when you grade it, okay, you are thinking of all these factors. If you do have a rubric in front of you for actual OPI, there is no rubric, but there are guidelines you need to rely on. So if you look at the accuracy part, there are 4 components in that, right? So it's not that Oxford ignores accuracy in the language. It does measure that, but it's not in a way that's isolated. Okay? So I'm going to give you something very different so that you take you off this language world, give you a very concrete example of Comet. Are you aware of Comet? Is that also a company here? Comet is like a very famous company in Chicago that distributes the electric, you know, electric power. And I'm giving you this example to take you off the language context to show you what I'm talking about. And this is going to be my conclusion slides, basically. So the target domain for them is the technical occupation selection system. This is like basically the thing they want their employees to do. Is the target context, okay? So the construct, one of the key constructs to do that is the knowledge and the ability of using tools, okay? This is like a scenario I'm creating, it's not real, by the way, okay? So then we are talking about like just a piece of construct here, not everything, okay? Is aligned with that. And then a guy who is preparing employees for this test, employment test, is creating a course, and the course is a modern man's guide to, but by the way, this is a real course online. I found it, it's a real course, it's just like a funny course that teaches you how to use tools. Okay, and then the unit or module is a screwdriver unit. We are talking particularly about different types of screwdrivers. Okay? And the objective is the ability to use the right screwdrivers for different kinds of screws. What is this? This is my construct. So think of this unit, okay? So I'm trying to measure this thing. What is that? Again, remember this because this will be very important. The ability to do what? To use, okay, the screwdriver, the right screwdrivers for different kinds of screws. That's a key component in this kind of operational context. Now, I decided to create a test to measure this skill. Okay? So follow me carefully because this is going to be a very concrete example of what I'm trying to say. Option 1. Okay? I created a task and I'm saying, okay, match the words to images. Okay? So, and even I created like fancy, let's say, online test, and it does all of this. Okay, so remember what was my target construct? The ability to use the right screwdrivers for different kinds of screws. And this is how I measure it. I just ask them to match the words to the images. What's the point here? I want them to know, or I want to see if they know, I'm underlining this, if they know the names of what? Screws. This is what? The knowledge of. Okay? What can we infer about after we give them this test that's a multiple of this, and we get A, perfect A out of this? Can we claim that they can use? Can you claim that? Yes, you can claim. It's easy, right? But can you justify this? You know what is validity in testing? It's a big word, right? In simple words, they're gonna kill me if they watch this recording. In simple words, it is this justification that you're trying to do. To what extent validity in testing is to what extent you can justify that the meaning of this score is representative of that language, that skill that you are trying to test. Okay? Let's say I try to be more creative. Okay, this is probably not a good idea. Let's do another task. So instead, I said no words. Okay? I said, okay, now match the screwdrivers to the appropriate screw they can, okay, or they should be used. Okay, so I'm kind of creating more meaningful tasks, right? Because I want them to match this. Okay? Again, what this can tell me about their ability to use, how much I can infer from this task and claim that they can use, my claim is, remember, they know, they use the right screwdrivers for the screws. How much you can justify this? This is an open-ended question. Like, do you think you have enough evidence?
More than the first one.
More than the first one, yes. That's why I was more creative. I was a little bit more creative, more than first, but again, is it enough? Not really. Yes, now come to the task-based approach. Okay? Now, think of this task. Okay? The teacher brings 4 different types of electronic devices, okay, that are the key component of the work, not any, like whatever ComEd needs as a device, you know, the way they operationalize in day-to-day work, okay? And brings 4 different types of screws, but how many types of screwdrivers? 6. That's the assessment principle. If you bring 4 and 4, then you know you give them 50% chance. But here you bring more. Either one of this should be more than the other. Okay? And then what is the task? These are the materials. The task is each student individually is asked to assemble the electronic device in a random order. They have 4, remember, using screws and screwdrivers, and then disassemble each device. Okay? So now think of this task compared to the previous 2. Okay? So first of all, this can be called a task. Can we call the other 2 a task? Or just a question? Okay, I would feel hesitant to call the previous 2 a task. Okay, but this is a task. Okay, this is a real life task they will be doing, and I'm simulating that in my classroom. Okay, I am testing what here? The ability to use. Comparing to the other 2, what is my justification level here? Has it increased? A lot? Yes, a lot. This is probably one of the best way you can measure that particular skill that you're interested in. Yeah, we call all of the 3 a test. Okay, but number 3, this task can give me the best evidence. Is it real life yet? No. You know, what would be the ideal way of measuring this skill? You would put them in operations, right? You would observe them doing that work, and you would create a report out of that, and that will be do as they work. Okay, but that's impossible and that's dangerous, right? Because this is also very important, because we don't want them to do it yet. We want them we want to see if they're ready doing it. Therefore, we are creating a simulation, a task that is simulating that environment, right? And then we are using that as a task here, and whatever we gain as an evidence will tell us basically to what extent they can do that in real life. Am I clear about what I mean when I say proficiency oriented? So this task is proficiency oriented. Okay? The first one was an achievement test. Okay? Maybe it's important doing that kind of test item during the unit. Right? I'm not saying throw away the achievement tests. I'm not saying this, okay? But what I am claiming and recommending is let's do not use achievement tests as a summative assessment at the end of the year. Because they cannot tell you enough about what students can do. They will tell you a lot about what they know. And it's too late if you know what students know or don't know at the end of the year. What's the point of knowing what students know and don't know? It's more useful during the year. Okay? We teach something like a target structure, and we want to test to see how much they know, so that we either revise, revisit, or skip during the year. Okay? Am I clear about this? Perfect. So let's look at the key takeaways. Okay, and I'll look at my conclusion slides before the break. And how much break we can have? Maybe it's like
Whatever. I mean,
whatever. Yeah.
I would say probably at least 10 minutes.
10 minutes, and then we'll do the second part where you will actually be doing everything I just told you in the first part. Okay? So the key takeaway, number one, the test should be useful. Okay? For what? For its intended purposes. That's very important. You need to know what is the purpose of that task before you even start designing it, so that it works for that purpose. If your purpose is to see how much they know, what kind of task you should be doing? You must be doing achievement test. Okay, that's your purpose. But if your purpose is to see what they can do with the language, then you should be thinking of what kind of test? A proficiency test. So the purpose and the test must align there. Number two, therefore, before we even start developing a test, we should define the intended purposes. Okay? And then today we are talking about one purpose here. Okay? But you can have many different purposes. We are talking about summative assessment, and we are talking about proficiency as a purpose. Okay? What they can do with the language. We should be defining the target language use domain for the intended purposes. Is it the classroom that we are interested in, or is it the real life context once they leave our class? Okay, we should be thinking about this. We should be thinking of the construct. Okay? And then all of this, kind of, if you agree with Act 4 guidelines, has been done for you. Okay, and they have been put into, again, different proficiency levels even, not just one level, it's multiple levels. So now, we agree that that construct is representative of the target language use domain, which is the real life language use, functional language use, that's very important. It's not just any language use. You could be in a foreign country, living there for 5 years, but not functionally using language. I have seen these people. I mean, ESL students, simply put ESL students as an example. They come from X country to United States. They even have high TOEFL scores, but they live in a bubble of their own community, especially in small places like where I came from, Iowa, Ames, Iowa, or here even, where everything is about their target language, and they have access to that, to people. So the only thing they do is going to lectures or classes, listen, do assignments, and leave. Okay, so, but this is also happening. But when we say target language is domain, we are talking about functionally using that language. Okay, so the students are actually active using it. Okay, and then at the end, the test or the tasks in the test or the assessments in the test must well represent or measure this construct so that we can claim that they can do X, Y, Z with the language at the end. Okay? Therefore, at the end, it's actually a matter of fairness, right? Remember my Fulbright example? If you are giving a Fulbright test to the student and you're claiming he's fine, and the student goes there and fails, okay, it's not fair to who first? To him, first of all. Okay, to the student itself. It's not fair to the institution hosting the student. It's not fair to the Fulbright giving scholarship. So at the end, we are talking about fairness here. So that's why actually it is so important when we design a test, because the decisions we are making based on these tests could be very high stakes decisions, and they would impact something. So that's kind of another responsibility on top of the teaching, that we do, is to make sure that what we say, what we claim, is justified. Okay, I'll stop here, and then we'll have a 10-minute break, and then we'll hopefully do some hands-on activity at the end.